It's a true honor to be here. I'm delighted to be in a room full of women interested in hearing about conflict. I've been in this space for over 20 years now, and I'm delighted to actually follow after this really excellent panel. I'm hoping to complement some of the things you heard during that panel. I felt there was a lot said about interdisciplinarity in this context, collaboration with communities, collaboration with organizations on the ground, the ethics around collecting data and using data in this space. But what I'm hoping to do that complements all this discussion is really thinking about how to bring it in the academic context and what it means to publish in this space and to what degree actually collecting original data in the field gets rewarded, where people publish, et cetera, et cetera. The way I decided to structure this today for you is literally by taking you in a tour of some of these conflict zones, but also trying to situate some of the work that's being done in a methodological perspective. So as our colleagues discussed in the previous panel, there's an array of different tools that people are using in data and data analytics. But what I'm going to try to show is the importance of grounding them in a causal inference framework. So actually trying to identify effects that are actually causal effects, and also being able to provide information on the underlying mechanisms and channels while doing that, and thinking about how to integrate an array of different methods in this process. Just by starting, I mean, Michelle gave you a sense of my kind of general academic trajectory, but if I had to say what type of scholar I am, I would say that my scholarship fits in the political economy of violence and conflict, and that actually means having published in an array of different journals that are ranged from political science to development economics to computational social science and general interest journals. So this is very much a truly interdisciplinary space and field. In my experience, the field rewards original work in that space, and I'll start by highlighting some of that with some field experiments and randomized control trials. And I'm actually delighted to say that our colleagues at JPAL here at MIT just announced a new initiative on their humanitarian protection initiative and their displaced livelihoods initiatives, just, I think, elevating the importance of being in the field in this conflict space as well. So some of the questions I looked at revolve around conflict and cooperation and the role of identity, material incentives, networks, and institutions. So these are the different types of kind of variables that I looked at and the role they played. And we will also talk about the different measures that went into this type of research. And I have asked a divergent set of research questions that relate to conflict contexts. One big question that still many people have been trying to address, and a lot of the findings are inconclusive, is whether development aid during conflict decreases the levels of violence, whether community policing can improve levels of trust post-conflict, whether integrated institutions can increase contributions to public goods after violent conflict, the effects of segregation and sectarianism on public service provision, and whether cell phone records and social media data can accurately capture violence narratives, migration, and displacement dynamics during conflict. So in my line of inquiry, as I said, I've used and integrated an array of different methods, and the three different sets of works that I'm going to present for you today involve randomized control trials in the field, so large field experiments, lab in the field experiments, so again, introducing randomization in the field through a particular treatment. And then I'll also talk about work that has focused on remote types of data involving call detail records and social media data, and also thinking about ways how to validate that data from information directly collected from constituents in the field. So starting out with field experiments, the kind of context of randomized control trials. This is something that obviously is kind of a golden standard in terms of really allowing people to think about causality in a very clear and direct way. And in the context of my work, I was able to exploit some institutional designs around development aid in conflict and policing and community trust. And the settings that I pursued this work in was one particular country, 10 different districts, 500 villages, as I will be discussing, looking at Afghanistan, but then also community policing interventions in 6 different contexts. So 6 large field experiments, and trying to explain and understand the different leverage one would get from these types of designs. So looking at this field experiment that was basically an impact evaluation of the largest Afghan development aid program. The challenge with development aid, and as I said, we have a lot of conflicting findings as to whether it leads to lowering violence or it may actually lead to upticks of violence. It's hard to determine the dynamics there because there's rarely random assignment of aid. We usually give aid in areas that are needier, or give aid in areas that we have access to, or give aid in areas that we're trying to flip to our side. So it's very difficult to determine what is actually the causal effect of providing aid in lowering of violent outcomes. In our case, we had the opportunity, this rare opportunity, to actually randomly assign aid. And the reason this was ethical was because there were financial constraints. The program at that stage could only roll out in 250 villages, and we had the opportunity to kind of randomly assign across 500 and then promise that we will mobilize these 250 villages that were in control in the next round of available funding. So here we are in Afghanistan. The evaluation covered 10 different districts, so we had a lot of geographic variation across 6 different provinces. It was quite representative also in terms of ethnicity and language. And this was an evaluation that lasted over 4 years. It was across 500 villages. So what was interesting, usually one of the constraints around these field experiments is that they tend to be a one-shot type experiment. So you have a baseline and one follow-up. In our case, we were able to track the communities over 2 different instances of time, and then we had one extra, actually another set of data collection that revolved around a behavioral intervention as well. So just to give you a sense of the structure of the evaluation, we started out with a baseline survey. Then the treatment was introduced, and it was a bundled treatment, as we would call it, because it involved the creation of community councils that were getting elected by the community, and the selection of development projects. So these villages were given money, and they were given the opportunity to select a development project that suited their community needs. Then after project implementation, we went and collected our first follow-up survey data. So this was basically after the introduction of the program and while the projects were being built, but before they were delivering any goods. And then after the completion of the projects, we had another follow-up survey in the communities. So I should say that this involved data collection across 15,000 households in these 500 villages. And just to give you a sense of the types of projects, this small road was one example. They were small local type projects. The village well was, for example, a type of project that was introduced. And this was data collection happening on the household level. This is the male head of household and a female head of household being surveyed as part of this process. So this there was an array of different papers that we were able to write based on this intervention, exactly because it addressed issues that were not only had to do with violence and development, but also gender and development, local elections and development, electoral designs and development. There was an array of different things that we were able to exploit thanks to this randomization. But the one I wanted to talk about today, which is forthcoming in the American Economic Journal, Applied Economics, looks at whether these development aid programs can actually counter insurgencies. So for this purpose, not only did we exploit this random assignment of aid, we also used, obviously, the survey data that we're collecting to get at attitudes. We also were collecting data on behaviors, and we also combined all of this with events data on security that we got from the coalition forces on the ground. So NATO forces provided us with actual violence data as they were collecting it. So what's interesting here in the patterns of violence and kind of in the findings that we identify is that there's no yes, there is a lowering of violence, or yes, there is an uptick of violence. The interesting finding was that there was actual heterogeneity. So in areas where the insurgency was locally rooted, so the people, the local Afghans were the ones that had picked up arms against the government, we found that the program, which was a program run by the Afghan government and supported by the World Bank, was reducing violence. But in areas where the insurgency was actually driven by outside militants, which were the areas bordering Pakistan, we actually found an increase in violence. So we found that in those areas, having a development aid by a program run by the government actually increased the targeting of these communities. So I think one of the interesting findings here is actually paying attention to heterogeneity. And of course, we explored an array of different mechanisms and showed that it was not driven by opium production, it was not driven by ethnic dynamics, et cetera, et cetera. So this, as I said, this was a very big program. It was actually like almost a $3 billion program, just to give you a sense of the size. I was listening very closely to Daphne when she said, what is the best use of $1 million? In our case, this is how much our data collection cost. It cost us $1 million over 4 different instances of data collection, 15,000 households, 500 villages. Cost me typhoid and cholera on top of that. But it was a massive and really expensive program. So obviously, if an impact evaluation was considered a very reasonable kind of price tag for something of that sort, and obviously understanding whether it made sense to be spending all this money. But as I said, even the golden standard of this type of evaluation has its critics. I mean, it's very costly. In some cases, people don't have dynamics. We would like to have dynamics because we revisited these communities over 3 different times. But in many other cases, as I said, it's kind of a baseline and a one-shot follow-up. And then there's always the question of generality. Okay, does this apply elsewhere in Afghanistan? Did it apply in the Afghan South? Does it apply in other parts of the world where we're facing violence and we're giving development aid? And these were actually extremely valid questions because at the time there were colleagues doing similar work in other places. There were colleagues looking at the effects of development aid on violence in the Congo, in Liberia, in the Philippines, and we were all getting different results. We're all looking at community development aid type programs, and we're all getting divergent results, which was very frustrating because we didn't know if we could attribute it to the fact that it's just a different context. You know, some of us were in Africa and others in Asia and others in East Asia. Or is it because of the variation of the treatment, so the intensity of the intervention, be it kind of the level of money spent or the timeline, how long we were on the ground? Or is it because we're just using different measurements? Like we had different surveys, different behavioral measures. So this was indeed frustrating, exactly for all the reasons that I highlighted. So it was very interesting to me to have the opportunity to then work with a different team of colleagues in evidence in governance and politics group, which is a kind of a very interdisciplinary group of mostly political scientists, but also sociologists and economists. They decided to launch what they call the Metaketa initiative. And the idea there is let's have a set of these randomized controlled trials where we're basically introducing we're asking the exact same question, we're introducing a very similar intervention, and we're pursuing practically identical measurement strategy. So basically this way, we can say if we do find differences, we can be more certain that we can attribute those to context. So in the Metaketa initiative I was involved in, which I have to say, given it happened in 6 different settings. So it was Pakistan, Liberia, Uganda, Brazil, Colombia, and the Philippines. And I was one of the 3 members of the coordinating committee, along with Jeremy Weinstein from Stanford and Graham Blair from UCLA. Basically looked at the effects of community policing post-conflict in these spaces. And the treatment was, again, a bundled treatment that involved community patrols, town hall meetings, and kind of hotlines reporting crime. And there was a random assignment of this type of interventions to the communities. And what was fascinating about this work, which appeared in Science and is also coming out as a book later this year, is that we actually got a null effect. So we found no effect on any of our array of variables. And the only reason why a null effect like this, I shouldn't say the only reason, but it's very likely that the reason why a null effect made it into science, and I think we are all aware of publication bias and how hard it is to get a null effect published anywhere, is because of this very robust design. It's because we had 6 randomized control trials. We had a very detailed pre-analysis plan that was pre-registered. There were clearly no power issues associated with any of these analyses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And another very compelling reason has to do with the fact that people are spending a lot of money thinking that these community interventions work in the policing space. And some of it has to do with the fact that they did work in the US and the UK, so there was this presumption that they should also work in the global south. But what we're seeing here is because there are all these other types of resource constraints in this context, the presumption that you can take something from kind of the global north and just implant it there and it will work was not what we found and what was happening. And I should say that this was quite an expensive enterprise as well to do, and it was supported by the UK Development Office in very strong ways, and kind of others supported this as well. So I have an appreciation that these projects can only happen if there is an array of different colleagues involved, different organizations, on the ground, constituents. There's a lot of buy-in involved in different ways. So it's hard to, this is not something that some researcher pulls off on their own. And I do have to say that the first one I started out as a graduate student. So it's not that it's impossible. Actually, there were 3 of us graduate students at Harvard at the time that were engaging in that. But we did have funding from the World Bank to do the data collection, et cetera, et cetera. It's just that you cannot this is not the type of thing that you do as a dissertation project. But the type of thing that one could be doing as a dissertation project, for those of you that are considering grad school and are thinking of operating in this space, and you know, someone who's driven by causal inference, are interested in experiments, is thinking about lab in the field experiments. So kind of bringing, introducing your own treatment in this context, using obviously existing measurement tools from different disciplines. And I'm going to present, I've done a few different things in this space, but I'm going to present a couple of them just because they both speak to the broader theme of segregation or integration in the context of conflict. So one exploited the integration in a secondary school system after the end of a conflict and tried to see the effect that that had in service provision, attitudes towards service provision, and the other exploited natural patterns of segregation to try to assess, again, attitudes towards service provision and effects and access. So the first one was literally exploiting a natural experiment, and within that we embedded a public goods game. So this took place in the city of Mostar, which is kind of famous in Bosnia-Herzegovina for this beautiful bridge that was kind of a way to connect the town across its 2 sides, but became this kind of was in many ways the fighting line during the war, and it was destroyed during the war, luckily rebuilt. But what you see on the right side, which is a beautiful building, bullet-ridden, as you can see in the front, was the school that became the integrated school. So basically, 10 years after the end of the conflict, the international community decided to work with the 4 existing high schools in that city, the classical high schools called gymnasia. 2 of them were Catholic Croat and the other 2 Bosniak Muslim. And they decided to kind of jumpstart an integrated school by bringing together one of the Muslim households with one of the Catholic ones. And in order to make sure that there was attendance, because you can imagine the local community was not necessarily keen on this integration, they mandated that, in collaboration with the local authorities, that the parents could not take their kids out of the schools that they were initially registered in. So we basically exploited this kind of as if random assignment to an integrated school, because usually we cannot speak to school integration effects because it could be the parents that are more open-minded sending their kids to that school, or it could be the school, or it could be an interaction effect. Here we knew it had not, the assignment was taken care of for us, and obviously we validated that it was as if random. And then we went in and played public goods games with these kids. So we basically, the question we're looking at was whether post-conflict institutional integration can improve interethnic cooperation using these n-person public goods games to try to understand people's willingness to contribute to a public good. And then we did find that on average, the integrated institutions contributed to a significant increase in the contribution to public goods. And seeing, we also saw that the availability of sanctions as a measure to get other people to be more cooperative in this context only worked in the context of the integrated school. So this was an interesting finding, and I have to say the budget for this project was $10,000. So this is just to give a sense of the difference in scale, and it was extremely rewarding, and it was something that I came across doing some other type of research in the field. So I appreciate that one needs to be very aware of field settings to be able to take advantage of some of these opportunities. But I just want to signal that, you know, not everything is impossibly expensive, and that project was also something that we started as graduate students. So, but then I was also very motivated in continuing to think about how to interact and engage with such type of interventions in the field in the context of integration segregation. So another place that I worked with was Iraq, and specifically the divided city of Baghdad. The area there was clearly, the main concern there was around sectarianism. It was after the war, and there were many neighborhoods in Iraq that were divided across sectarian lines, so Sunni and Shia. And again, I was interested in understanding how people navigate this space, this segregated space. So we focused on this highly sectarian context, and we randomly assigned participants to obtain information about local government services and access to them in Sunni and Shia areas of Baghdad. And we picked people from the Baghdad neighborhoods of Kadhimiya, which is a Shia-dominated neighborhood and known for one of the shrines of Musa Kadhim, and the Adhamiya neighborhood, which is a Sunni-dominated neighborhood, also very known for one of the Sunni mosques in the area, and they're literally divided by the Tigris River. And what was very interesting there was we found that despite being a minority, the Sunnis were a lot more successful than the Shia in securing access and information about access in services in both their co-sect and in their cross-sect areas. And, you know, unpacking why that is, why is this minority a more kind of politically savvy minority in getting itself access? Some people were suggesting that it must be a legacy effect because, you know, Saddam Hussein, who was the leader for a long time in Iraq, was a Sunni, so therefore maybe it's some legacy effect, even though the people who were participating in here were youth. They were kids that became of age after the end of the US invasion in Iraq, after 2003. So what was interesting here, and this is where we did some network analysis, was seeing that Sunnis and Shia used their networks very differently. We were able to track this because we were using cell phones for this particular task, and also a lot of very detailed self-reporting on surveys. So what we noticed was that the Sunnis would turn to older contacts for information, which also ended up meaning higher quality information than the Shia, who turned to peers and seemed to be more stilted because of kind of stricter hierarchies within how the Shia community operates. It was also very interesting to see how the Sunnis were a lot more likely to reach cross-sect to get information. So they were more likely to try to reach to their Shia acquaintances if they had to secure services in a Shia neighborhood, rather than the Shia who stuck to their own co-sect acquaintances, irrespective of where they needed to get information from. So this is just an example of how one could be collecting very detailed network level information, and I'm happy to share all of our protocols and kind of design around this to try to explain an interesting kind of effect that we find. Similarly, we were also very interested in understanding to what degree this geographic segregation affected the daily lives, the mobility of these citizens, and how they chose to navigate themselves through their neighborhoods. And again, this is the Jihad neighborhood of Baghdad, which had a very particular type of segregation that we felt enabled an interesting design around mobility. So we basically measured their movement with custom location tracking. And again, this was all consent-driven, and all of these experiments have received very rigorous human subjects approvals. And basically, participants were assigned to so-called treasure hunts. So they had to navigate through different spaces of their neighborhood to get at places. And what was interesting for us to see, and you see how we were kind of tracking them with this device, is that in a 1 kilometer walking task, the Shia would increase their walk time by over a third, so by over 340 meters, to avoid Sunni areas, while the Sunnis would only do this for about 100 meters. So it was interesting to see kind of the difference in how much more kind of averse one of the groups was over interacting in the space of the other group than the other. And of course, these mobility constraints and intentional avoidance of spaces obviously can be translated into costly effects in terms of economic and political development, this level of integration. But again, we did this in 2014, 2015, when it was the, Pokemon Go. I don't know, you're probably all too young to remember this, but to give you a sense that this was actually kind of cool at the time. So all of these are pretty dated projects, but I think the important thing that gets signaled here, as I said, is how to think about introducing an experiment and running these type of treatments in a way that actually allows you to get results that not only are they causally identified, but also allow you to get at the underlying mechanisms. At the same time, where we were experimenting in the field in different ways, field experiments, lab in the field experiments, computing became a lot cheaper. So again, I'm dating myself here, over 12 years ago now. But for us, it was a big revelation. It was, oh, wow, okay, now we can start doing things that not just descriptive, and I'm not minimizing by any means any of the spatial or visualization work and the analytics. I think this is all extremely important and really relevant, but also trying to think of how do we exploit all this stuff and think about it in a causal inferential way. So there was this kind of let's turn to big data, and obviously satellite data, call detail records, social media data were becoming all more prominently used, and just thinking about how to do this that was not just purely descriptive. And one of the works in that vein was really thinking about exogenous violent shocks, so exploiting exogenous violent shocks as a way to get at causality. So what we did here was basically we combined machine learning techniques with statistical tools, specifically a traditional panel fixed effects model and anomaly detection methods to capture the effects on cell phone communications brought about by exogenous violent shocks in the form of drone strikes. So basically what's interesting about Yemen is that it had been at the time, and it still is, one of the most targeted areas from the US in terms of drone strikes. So, and that is an exogenous shock. The local communities don't know when a drone strike is coming or happening. So we used call detail records that we had. We had 3 years worth of call detail records from one of the largest cell phone company in Yemen. So it gives you a sense. We had 21 billion calls from 6 million subscribers, which was basically a fourth of Yemen's population in 2010. And we had it for 3 years, 2010 to 2012. And which we matched with tower location data. Basically, we knew when a call started, ended, who received, who made the call, and kind of the tower ID and the duration. Obviously, this was fully anonymized, and the level of aggregation that we present the results in would never allow any de-anonymization to happen, just to be clear on this front. And of course, when we're looking at this data, just to get a very general sense of are they capturing anything, it was interesting to see that they were really capturing kind of the flow of Yemeni everyday life. So you see calls picking up after morning prayer around 5 or 6 a.m. Then there's a big dip in calls during Friday prayer, which happens at noon. Then there was a plateau when they like to chew khat, which is a local amphetamine. It's a plant that everybody chews after lunch in Yemen. And then, it's kind of a delayed gratification. You don't get a kick until maybe maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours after, and that's when you see the uptick. They start calling everybody. I remember I would get calls from my research assistants at 9 p.m. and try to understand why they were so excited with ideas. And then, you see a drop. You see a drop again after 9:30 p.m. And I should say it's fully legal in Yemen, and it's something that both women and men engage in. It's a social activity, and I'm not going to go into the health and environmental implications of that, but it's a big cultural thing. And then what was interesting was also seeing kind of how data were capturing religious holidays. So if you see during Ramadan, the patterns would flip because people would be fasting during the day, so sleeping longer and being up a lot longer at night, talking, and then again a drop in the calls when they were breaking the fast. So, and obviously, was there anomaly detection? Yes. Did we see drone strikes? Yes. They were loud and clear. And we saw effects that were lasting across an array of different radii. But it still remained a pretty localized effect. So what this combination of methods allowed us to do was to also see what the effects would be for other events. So we compared the drone strike events against the presidential bombing that happened during the Arab Spring, but we also compared it against more kind of peaceful events like Eid al-Fitr, which is kind of a celebration after the end of Ramadan, or even the World Cup, where we found that those effects you could see across the country, while the kind of localized violent events like the drone strikes or the presidential bombing, there was a particular radius where the effect was noticed, and then it dissipated. We also in some forthcoming work, we also are looking at forced migration and drone strikes and kind of the effect of drone strikes in displacement and movement. And there we see, a lot of the ways people are trying to assess whether drone strikes work is by seeing if there is follow-up violence after them, and they find that, there isn't, so therefore they seem to be like surgical tools, especially since the effect is localized. What we're seeing here is that it really depends on how you measure disruption. So if you actually care about the local population, the fact that there is displacement that's both immediate and durable, I think is an interesting finding. So we find that mobility increased by 24% on strike days, and there was a distance from the strike region that kept increasing steadily for over a month, leading to a displacement for thousands of individuals. So it was interesting to see kind of that type of effect in mobility. So in Yemen, we only had cell phone records, and of course there was no content. That's the thing with cell phone records. You just use it as a signal, and there's a very particular subset of questions that can be asked. But with social media data, there is content. So we decided to look at that in terms of trying to capture violence narratives and what gets discussed during conflict. And the reason why we found this a fascinating question was because there is a bias in the type of platforms people use to study conflict and to generally study social media, with Twitter, now X, having been the most popular, and then also Facebook. What was interesting for us in the context of Syria, where we carried out this work, was that we were able to basically look at a similar subset of messages across 3 different platforms. So we're able to compare what gets posted on Twitter, on Facebook, and on Telegram, Telegram being very popular in that part of the world. And for that, we used the structural topic models and unsupervised method, and then also some word2vec to examine context similarity. And we did find very stark differences. So people were a lot more likely to post violent things in Telegram than Facebook, and a lot less on Twitter. And we also, looking at the, on the right, you see the different types of kind of topics covered. So except for kind of eulogies or violence against children or some discussions of pro-government intervention, where all 3 platforms seem to be posting similar content. For all the remaining topics that were violence related, there were very different levels of coverage based on the different platform, with Telegram being the most pronounced in terms of what was getting posted. And of course, some of it has to do with technological affordances. You know, Telegram doesn't delete while Twitter deletes, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of it also had to do with the intentionality of the actors, which of course interacts with those platforms. So what's interesting here is that one single, and we're using this just as an example, looking at the same exact actor posting across 3 platforms on the same day. This is a pro-opposition organization from Al Raqqa. They posted only in English a remembrance of a peaceful protester that died in 2011 in a protest against Assad. That's only in English with a drawing. On Telegram, that exact day, they're posting only news in Arabic of an ongoing clash between ISIS and government forces. And then on Facebook, again, the exact same day, the exact same organization, are posting both news of the ongoing violence, but also a shorter remembrance of the protester in Arabic and with a different photo. So it's interesting to see kind of the intentionality and the different things that appear in different platforms and what that means for the type of inference we're trying to get from these. And we actually validated the mechanisms around this by carrying out a survey with a lot of these people that were posting on these platforms that we were able to find and carry out kind of questionnaires, open-ended questionnaires on their kind of practices around these platforms and their attitudes towards the violence. We also combined the same social media data with the humanitarian data and geographic and population data, trying to understand whether we could get other types of information like displacement or refugee returns. What else could we be leveraging that's social media based? And indeed, we find that it was a valuable tool for assessing returns prospects, and it gave us a lot of information, kind of a more holistic view of the situation on the ground, being able to pair all these different sources of information. And indeed, the discussion of several factors differed at a statistically significant level in areas with and without returnees. And some of the conclusions showed that there were more discussion about governance structures and economic opportunities in places where there was return, lower in areas where there was ongoing violence, et cetera. So I want to pause for a second, and I have to say I was here for the previous panel. I was not here for the morning panel. And I'm just putting this up there because I feel like it's low-hanging fruit in many ways. I mean, obviously, I don't know I'm sure a lot of you have engaged in some sort of NLP work for your data and potentially even for violence questions. But I haven't seen much work out there yet, at least published. I don't know if it's in working form, for people using LLMs in conflict. And I think this idea of what can we be leveraging that's different from the traditional NLP methods we have been using, and how can we be using it in a clever way to get at some interesting answers. And of course, NLP is good for extraction, categorization, pattern identification. So we do topic modeling, entity recognition. LLM is, what's interesting about LLM is this generative capability. And this idea of, and because it's better in the speech and kind of the human speech, so much better than what we had before, this idea of can we simulate dialogues that are interesting that we could be using in survey experiments? Can we be creating vignettes and narratives? Is there a way to be actually using LLMs to improve our inference here? And of course, we know NLP is weak in understanding the nuance of human language, and we always curate and interpret, and that's also very true for LLMs, especially based on what they've been trained. But I do think there's an opportunity there, and something that I think folks that are interested in this and should be exploring, especially in the conflict context. So to summarize, and I know I took you to so many different parts of the world and many different methods, but I think the themes were pretty clear. And what I wanted to signal with this is that I started this work, as I said, over 20 years ago now, and I think some of the themes still are very relevant. Why are they relevant? Because they are basically the essence of how we do research design, how we do proper research in the academic context. And those things, it's not like they changed. we've always been very driven by causal inference. What has changed is, the methods, the tools, and updating these inferential processes, but the motivation is definitely the same. So the trend, I think, remains for causally identified. I say mixed methods here, and mixed methods doesn't necessarily mean, I do interviews. It could be an array of different things, but it basically means validating whatever it is that you're getting with information from the ground. Using clever measurement techniques that captures the dynamics from events, behaviors, attitudes. So this idea of really combining all these different data sources. Contextualizing your evidence and definitely speaking about what are the underlying mechanisms of the effects, what are the channels, and validating from the ground. So I have to say, I haven't done any large-scale field thing for 8 years now. I have a bit of a withdrawal. So now I've mostly been doing things with kind of remote data. But the idea that, you need to be validating, I think, is as important as ever, especially from places that are as fraught and complicated as conflict zones. Thank you so much for your attention.